Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis, the podcast where you hear from the embattled, shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, resilient, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis. My name is Andy Coulson and I created this podcast in the hope that the stories we share here will help guide you towards a more resilient approach to life and whatever it might throw at you. Slightly different episode this week as I'm on the road, quite literally, riding my bike with some pals from Land's End to John O'Groats. Other than an obvious midlife crisis, my reason for doing so is to raise some money and some awareness on behalf of the Our Brain Bank charity, which is focused on helping those who are diagnosed with a glioblastoma brain tumour, providing support and guidance for their families also. I became a trustee of OBB after my family lost my big sister, Deb, who died almost 4 years ago now from a GBM. My guest for this episode is my fellow OBB trustee, Richard Clemmow, a renowned journalist, radio scriptwriter and documentary maker. He was also the husband of pioneering TV executive Jana Bennett. As director of BBC TV, Jaina reached higher office at the Beeb than any woman before her. She transformed the corporation's science coverage, including creating Walking With Dinosaurs and introduced the iPlayer. Jaina sadly died of a GBM earlier this year. She was aged just 66, leaving Richard and their 2 children devastated, of course. In this podcast, Richard and I talk about our shared experience of GBM, the deadliest of cancers, the treatment of which, unfortunately, has not developed significantly in the last couple of decades. We discuss why that is and why OBB is so determined to shine a bright light on this terrible, terrible disease. Richard talks with power, clarity, and in incredibly moving detail about Jaina's determination and courage, and his courage as well in managing her illness, in essentially playing detective to try and prolong her life by finding new treatments. Was just startling, really. He also, along the way, gives us one of our best crisis cures yet, so listen out for that. I hope you enjoy this episode, and if it moves you to want to support our efforts with OBB, the sponsorship link for my ride is included in the episode summary. It's on our Instagram bio as well. And if you do, well, I thank you sincerely. Richard Clemmow, welcome to Crisis What Crisis, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
It's great to see you. Richard, I'd like to start, if I may, by saying that I am somewhat in awe of you. I say this because I'm now 3 days into this bike ride of mine from Land's End to John O'Groats. We've got as far as Berkeley and Somerset, where I'm talking to you, where we're recording this from now. I am a bit exhausted, I've got to tell you, despite having kitted myself out in enough lycra and carbon to keep Rafa, who sadly are not sponsoring me, in business for a while. All the gear and no idea is certainly, I think, the appropriate motto for me. And yet, Richard, I know that you did this exact same ride a number of years ago with your son, only you did it on mountain bikes without any fuss and without any lycra, I suspect. I take my overpriced cycling cap off to you, sir.
Yeah, I had no lycra. I had cotton shorts, I think. I did buy myself a new bike for the trip, but then my son saw the bike and decided that he rather fancied that, so he would ride that. Right. And I was left with my 25-year-old mountain bike. I changed the tires so they'd be slightly easier on the road, but apart from that, did nothing else. So it was done on a mountain bike.
There are 6 of us doing this ride, all of us sort of raising money for our own causes. But what's interesting, Richard, is that 3 of us have had, 3 of the 6 have had very close, inevitably tragic stories to tell about glioblastoma. We were discussing it on the ride today, in fact, just how prevalent it seems to be. And yet it is a disease, isn't it, that is still considered to be rare.
Yeah, I mean, I think the current figures are somewhere around 2,000 cases a year that people diagnosed with GBM, glioblastoma, in the UK. And sort of the official designation is any cancer where there's fewer than 4,000 cases is deemed a rare cancer. The lung cancer and breast cancer and ovarian cancer and so on, there are many more cases, but there are lots of other cancers where the numbers are in the low thousands, and they get categorized as rare.
Yeah. Obviously, I want to spend most of our time in this podcast talking about Jaina and talking about GBM, and obviously, we're working together with some other brilliant people at OBB, trying to find a way forward for GBM patients in the UK and their families.
Yeah, we found ourselves as trustees on this small charity, but it's focused on glioblastoma and what we can do to try and change the outlook for people who find themselves diagnosed and living with GBM. So
let's spend some time talking about that. Before we do, though, please, I'd love you to, if you don't mind, to talk a little about Jaina. The memorial service, which was held not long ago, which you organised with your son and daughter. Quite aside from being deeply moving, it was also, perhaps unsurprisingly, incredibly well attended. No surprise, given the impact that Jaina had on others at work and in so many other ways. If you would, please, just tell us a little about her life before the BBC, because one of the stories that was told at the memorial was this incredible journey that she had from, being born in New York and yet spending most of her childhood, formative years, in Bognor Regis.
Yeah, well, she was actually born in upstate New York in a place called Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame. Her parents were academics. Her father was trying to eke a living as a young academic and trying to get his doctorate. And they moved around the United States. So they lived in Kansas and Minnesota and all over the place. But then Gordon Bennett, being quite an extraordinary, eccentric guy, decided he wanted to take a sabbatical, and he loved British writers, Thomas Hardy in particular. And he persuaded the schools where his daughters were to let them out of school for a year. And as long as they kept a diary of their travels around Europe, they could go with their father and their mother on this year's sabbatical. And they did that. They spent most of the time in Britain, some time in Spain, where some of the daughters had brief flings with Spanish waiters, I understand. But that's the family story anyway.
Jaina was a very bright young lady, and did extremely well at Bognor Regis comp. We're speeding forward here, but her post-university, her career was stellar.
Well, she went from Bognor to Oxford, and she was with three others from Bognor Comprehensive. They were the first people to get to Oxford or Cambridge, and it was a kind of thing that the teachers wanted to show, that this comprehensive school, it was the first sort of cohort that had gone through an entire comprehensive education, wanted to prove that they could do as well as anyone else. So she found herself at Oxford along with three of her schoolmates. After that, she went off to the LSE and did a master's in international relations, and then she got onto a BBC training scheme as a BBC News trainee in 1979, I think it was, before I knew her, and she embarked on what ultimately became the main part of her career, was a career within the BBC, although she was there twice at two different times.
At the BBC, Jaina's success, as I touched on earlier, really was stellar. As director of BBC TV, she held or reached higher office than any woman that had come before her. She was a pioneer out of Bognor Regis, and she was a pioneer at the BBC. She transformed science coverage at the BBC, including her work on Horizon. She created Walking With Dinosaurs, which my children in particular would like to thank her for, a formative part of their education. She was in charge at the time of the introduction of the iPlayer, but she was also a great current affairs and news journalist. She loved the story, didn't she? She loved news.
Yeah, I mean that was her initial background, and she moved from current affairs, news and current affairs, into science, and she was brought into science to help them. It was at the time of the Chernobyl disaster, and they wanted someone with a kind of slightly harder edge to help them cover that, and that's how she made the move into science, and she rapidly did very well there and sort of brought a new perspective to try and toughen up some of the science programs. And she then went on to become an editor of a program called Antenna, and then editor of Horizon, and ultimately head of the science department. And under her, it flourished, and some of the programs you just mentioned were created, and it became a kind of hotbed of creativity. So that was an important part of what she did. But then later, after a brief stint in America, where she worked for Discovery Networks on a channel called TLC, she was the president of TLC. She came back. Greg Dyke, who was director general at the time, enticed her back to the UK to become director of television, which meant that she was in charge of all the BBC's television output. And I think she applied some of the same principles: the story, the curiosity, the feeling that audiences shouldn't be looked down on; that they should be given things they could really get their teeth into, that was going to excite them, stories that would excite them. And yes, she applied that kind of across the board, certainly in the factual area. Yeah. And also, there were things that under her watch that are really quite important. The revival of Doctor Who, the introduction of Strictly Come Dancing, all sorts of interesting programs that she had a knack of seeing what would excite people and interest people.
In that job, particularly as a director of all the BBC TV channels, fair few crises, I imagine, around the kitchen table at home. It tends to attract those high profile, rather difficult moments for the leadership of the corporation. Yes, I'm sure it's no different for Jaina. What was her approach?
She was always very calm about them, actually. She was very, she never got overexcited about them. She always tried to kind of view them in perspective, and didn't worry too much. She wanted to get things right, but she wasn't going to go into panic mode.
Outside of work, the two of you, I know, love to travel before your children, and then when the children came along as well. There are lots of stories that came out in the memorial service about that. It was on a trip, wasn't it? A work trip, though, that you first realised that something was terribly wrong with Jaina. If you don't mind, Richard, could you just sort of take us through those first days and weeks, really?
Yeah, I mean, she had just left a job in New York with A&E, Arts and Entertainment Networks, where she was president of the History Channel, the boss of the History Channel, and she just started working as a consultant, and she was doing consultancy in the UK and also in the United States, and it was the first trip that she was doing by herself in this new capacity, and she had appointments on the East Coast and the West Coast, and I was back in the UK, and she sort of rang me up and messaged me and things, and there was obviously something not quite right. She was seeing friends in New York, and they said, well, Jaina, who was often late, had turned up so late. She turned up an hour and a half after she's meant to, and they said, she's dragging her feet, she doesn't look well. And she rang me up and said, look, I don't know what's going wrong. I've been on the New York subway, and I've gone around the same loop twice, and I know it so well because I do it every day, or have done it every day, but I just didn't know where to get off. And we still had an apartment in New York at the time, and she was staying there while she was working in New York, and she was in the kitchen. She said, I can't find, she wanted a glass of wine, and she said, I can't find the corkscrew. And I said, it's in the drawer where it always is. And she said, no, I can't see it. So there clearly was something not quite right. And I went to fetch her from Heathrow Airport, and she came through out of the passport control and the customs, and I saw her coming off, and she looked dreadful. She was kind of dragging her left foot, and she looked completely frazzled. And I got her into the car, and I said, look, we knew that something was not quite right, and I made an appointment for CRGP that afternoon. But I said, look, this is not, you don't look well. Let's go straight to A&E. So we drove to Oxford and went into the A&E department in Oxford. I left her in the A&E and said, stay there, sit there. I have to go and park the car. I have to go and get into a car park. And the car parking in the John Radcliffe Hospital is awful. And it took me 20 minutes before I came back, and she wasn't there. And she just got up and started wandering around the hospital. And it took 3 hours to find her. Eventually, she was found in one part of the hospital. I was working with the security people, looking on video footage to try and trace where she'd been. And she didn't quite know what was going on.
When was this? Roughly?
This was in May. This is the beginning of May 2019. When she was in the US for that work trip, we thought maybe she'd had a mini stroke or something like that.
Yeah. Because
some of the symptoms were that, and we didn't know whether she should get treatment in the US or whether she'd come back. We decided she should come back. And on the advice of her cousin, a doctor in New York, and our GP, she dosed up with aspirin to try and protect against any further mini stroke. But anyway, we were back in the John Radcliffe Hospital, and by the end of that day, so we must have gone in around lunchtime, but by sort of early evening, they'd done a scan, and they said, I'm afraid we've found a tumor mass in your brain. And that was when we first knew that something was seriously wrong. They wanted to operate immediately, but because she dosed up with aspirin, which takes 10 days to get out of the system, she couldn't have an operation immediately. We had to wait for the aspirin to clear her system because of the risk of bleeding associated with aspirin. And she was given steroids, dexamethasone, which helps with the swelling, because the symptoms you get from GBM are to do with swelling of the brain where the tumor is impacting. And the sad and difficult thing about GBM is that you just don't know what's going to be affected, because it depends on which part of the brain where the tumor is. Looking back, we knew things had started going wrong a month or two earlier, because she was an inveterate texter, but her text messages became really garbled, and that had been going on for about 2 months. And there were one or two other things that, with hindsight, we realized were symptoms, but we didn't know it at the time.
The suspicion of a stroke is often, isn't it, the sort of flashpoint at the beginning.
But I think you've had experience with this, because your sister sadly also had GBM, glioblastoma.
That's right. Yes, and the it's interesting actually that you mentioned the text messages, because I'd completely forgotten about that. But that was definitely an early sign with Deb. I suspect it's an early sign with a lot of people now, because we all text. It's the preeminent form of communication, isn't it? But for Deb, actually, it was at work. She worked for a building company in Colchester, and she was the sort of admin hub, really, of this building company. And she just started getting a lot of things wrong. She was just getting very jumbled, and it's it was incredibly unlike her and her colleagues, and also her partner, who worked at, in fact, ran the company. He just became very concerned that there was something wrong, because Deb just never really got the admin wrong, never got the organisation of the company, organisational kind of functions of the company. She was entirely in charge of it and all over it. But then, the early symptoms were not dissimilar. Terrible amount of confusion and a real fear, and an initial belief, in fact, an initial diagnosis that it was purely a stroke. And then for Deb, she was admitted through A&E in Colchester, and it took a little while actually to get the diagnosis of a brain tumor. But even longer, of course, to get the diagnosis that it's a glioblastoma. And perhaps we should take a second here just to explain that, a glioblastoma is a particular type of brain tumor. It is unfortunately the deadliest type, and it's the deadliest type because it's almost impossible. Well, it is impossible to fully remove it. You can remove through an operation. In most cases, a fair bit of it, but you'll never really get shot of all of it, and that's why it is just so deadly.
Its full name is Glioblastoma Multiform, And the multiform is a key aspect of this. It comes in many different forms, and the tumors that are involved in this can be a wide variety of mutations. It's one of the most diverse or heterogeneous cancers there is, which makes it particularly difficult to treat. And as you say, I mean, surgery is difficult. In Jaina's case, she had surgery 10 days after the diagnosis, and it was Jaina always said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, because it was an awake surgery, which means that they don't give you a general anesthetic because they want to see what your responses are whilst you're under the knife, to check that they're not doing any undue harm in the course of cutting out the tumor. And so there's a psychologist who's sitting right next to your head whilst this operation is going on, and is showing you an iPad or a tablet with images or words, and trying to get your response all the time to see what's going on. In Jaina's case, this was a 9-hour operation, and she said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done. She knew beforehand that the one thing you don't want to do, it's very, very tiring. You don't want to fall asleep, because if you fall asleep, the surgeon has to stop the operation and maybe can't get out as much tumor as might otherwise be possible. And so she was desperate not to fall asleep. At one point, the psychologist said to her, "You're getting a bit tired, aren't you?" And she said, "Yes, I am." She, can I play some music to help you stay awake? And Jaina said, yeah. And then one of her favorite singers is Neil Young, and so she asked for Harvest Moon, and so she was swinging along to Harvest Moon whilst the surgeon was getting out more of this tumor. He said at the end, and you talked about it, he said he got 98% of it out, but because the tumor was growing around the carotid artery, he couldn't go right up against the artery for risk of damaging it, which would have been fatal. And so he said, well, there will be some residual tumor there, and I'm afraid, if there's residual tumor, the likelihood is that it will regrow at some point. So we knew, even after this very long operation, which Jaina faced in an extraordinary way, we knew that the likelihood was that there would be regrowth.
What did you do, Richard, when the diagnosis was given? Where did you turn first, if in terms of your search for information?
Well, with hindsight, I wish we'd done things slightly differently. I mean, the shock of the initial diagnosis is extraordinary, and then when you're told about it by some of the specialist staff there, you go into a meeting and they say, "Don't Google this." Of course, that's ridiculous. You do Google it because you want to start finding things out. And you're told that the prognosis is very poor. You're told you're going to get the best possible treatment, often referred to as gold standard treatment, which involves surgery, what they call maximal resection, i.e. cutting out as much of the tumor as possible, followed by radiotherapy and chemotherapy. And this is all a protocol for dealing with glioblastoma that's been around since the early 2000s, so about sort of 15 years now. And that is the standard form of treatment. You asked what I did. Jaina was in hospital because she was, they put her on steroids and were trying to kind of control the initial effects of the tumor whilst they waited for the aspirin to go out of her system. So she was in hospital for, I think it was about 4 or 5 days, just to before she came home and then went back in for the operation. But so on that first day after the diagnosis, I think I came home and cried. It's funny. I think that was the only time through the whole of the nearly 2 3/4 years,
yes,
until Jaina died, when I actually cried and felt so kind of helpless about things. The way we both sort of approach things, I suppose, kind of relates to our background as journalists, that we wanted to find out as much as possible. And we started doing that as quickly as possible. But it's a slow process because we're not medics. And despite Jaina's background in science department, she's not a scientist, she's not a medic. And it involved doing as much reading as possible and talking to as many people as possible and ringing up doctors around the world and trying to get just a half an hour with them on the phone, which is extremely difficult most of the time. And we talked to doctors in the UK, we talked to doctors in the US, we talked to doctors in Germany, and tried to get the best possible understanding of this disease and what the options were. And the trouble was, this process actually was continuous throughout the whole disease, and we learned more and more as we went along. And I now say, with hindsight, I wish I'd known at the beginning what I know at the end, because I think we might have approached the treatment slightly differently.
Let's talk about that in a second. It's very important. For I recognise all that, because for my family, for Deb's other brothers and sisters, and for our mum and dad and others, I felt, to me, in those days, because Deb also had an operation pretty quickly that was deemed a success. It felt like the sort of worst kind of, like a nightmarish treasure hunt, where you're going from clue to clue, trying to work out what treatments there are out there, what sort of secrets you might uncover that could lead to, never a cure, like as a journalist, you very quickly realize and appreciate, what GBM is and what the prognosis is. But you realize you're in a battle for time. You are trying to, as a loved one of a GBM, someone with GBM, you realize that the best you can do for them is to try and buy more quality time in their life. And so there's that. For me, it was that sort of treasure hunt bit, but also it became like the sort of the worst kind of FOMO, right? Fear of missing out, that there's something out there. You hear whispers of a clinical trial, or a doctor might pull you to one side and say, if I were you, I'd go and talk to this German doctor, or if I were you, I'd go and have a look at what they're doing, in this particular American state. And you do it, of course you do it, but my goodness, it adds to the terrible stress of what is obviously an appalling situation for anyone that find themselves in the orbit of GBM. Does that feel about right to you? Did you recognise some of that?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, I think the problem is, throughout this, no matter how much research you do, how much of an expert you turn into in the course of this, ultimately we just don't know what's going to be best. And you can never know whether the things you've done have helped or not. You can say you think they have, and maybe I'll talk a bit about things that we did for Jaina, which I think gave her, as you say, extra months where the quality of life was reasonably good. And throughout all this, you're also trying to balance the terrible fear that the treatment that might be beneficial might also have terrible side effects. And so that quality of life, which actually, when we think about it, I think is the most important thing.
Yes.
To
not just time, but quality time. Yeah.
No, we were lucky, because when you're first diagnosed with GBM, you learn that the so-called the MOS, or the median overall survival, is about a year to 14 months. That means that there's the largest number of people who die from GBM die within sort of 12 to 14 months, and that very few make 5 years, and beyond that there's almost no one who survives more than 5 years.
We'll be right back after this. As regular listeners know, Crisis What Crisis is brought to you with a little help from Mindstream, a personal well-being music company designed to create those calmer moments in our hectic lives. Mindstream can really help put you back on track and guide you towards the mindfulness that we all need to function more effectively. And I can tell you from personal experience that it really works. Mindstream music is cleverly designed to help regulate your body's response to stressful situations by slowing your heartbeat and guiding you towards that more calmer state. They also have playlists to stimulate your brain, helping to keep you focused and engaged for longer periods of time. Getting your mindset right is the absolute key when you're navigating a crisis, or if you're just struggling with day-to-day pressures. You'll find them at mindstream.com, that's mind with a Y, They're also on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, wherever you download your music from. So take back some control and consider making a Mindstream playlist one of your crisis cures. I don't think you'll regret it. And now back to Richard. I want you to tell me the things that you wish you'd done differently. Before you do, though, tell me how Jaina herself reacted to the diagnosis.
She was very calm about it, and her dad had died of cancer, actually pancreatic cancer, age 63. And she had said before the diagnosis, I just feel I'm going to get cancer at some point. And so when it came, she said, I knew this was going to happen. So in that, she wasn't fatalistic, but she was kind of realistic about it. She wanted to make sure that, the time that we had together and the family had together was the best possible time. At first, she didn't make it public that she'd been diagnosed with a brain tumor. And it wasn't until she was diagnosed in May, she had the operation fairly soon afterwards, and then radiotherapy and chemotherapy through that summer of 2019. But then we were talking to other people who had GBM or whose family members had GBM, and you rapidly discover there's a network of people out there. As we were saying right at the beginning of this conversation, it's, there are a couple of thousand cases a year in this country, and you rapidly sort of make connections. So my daughter had a colleague whose mother had GBM, and we talked to her, and that was really helpful. One of the other people we spoke to was Jessica Morris, who lived in New York, who'd been diagnosed with GBM a year or two previously, and it was a funny connection. It was my daughter's partner's father's partner, who happened to know Jessica Morris, and said, "Oh, you should talk to her." And we did. And that was a really valuable relationship. We had long conversations with Jessica. Jaina had long conversations with Jessica. And then Jessica had started up a charity in New York called Our Brain Bank. And she wanted to start a branch of it in the UK. And so she asked whether Jaina would be a trustee. And when OBB, Our Brain Bank UK, was launched in November 2019, Jaina decided she would go public about the fact that she had this disease. And it made a bit, it made some publicity for the charity. There were some newspaper articles, and she threw herself into that. She was on the board of the British Library. She was a trustee of a theatre company, and she was on Our Brain Bank. So she kept herself busy. She wanted to keep those connections going for as long as she possibly could, and she did right to the end.
Knowing what you know now, but perhaps just sort of knowing what you knew, some months later, what would you have done? What would you have done differently with Jaina's treatment?
Well, I think the key thing here, that we actually had a conversation with a consultant at the Royal Marsden Hospital. He wasn't treating Jaina, but we, again, through a family contact, we went to see him and had a conversation. He told us things that we largely already knew about GBM. But at the end of the conversation, he said, if I were you, I would get some genomic sequencing done of the tumor, because there may be options that are thrown up by doing some genetic sequencing of the tumor to find out what's driving the tumor growth. And this, I suppose, is really what I wish we'd known earlier. I wish we'd done earlier. The thing about glioblastoma multiform, as we mentioned earlier, is that it's very heterogeneous, which means that no two GBMs are likely to be similar, or very few. They can have all sorts of different mutations that are driving the tumor growth. In fact, it is one of the most diverse tumors in terms of the numbers of mutations and different kinds of mutations that can be driving it. And we had an analysis done which suggested that Jaina's tumor was similar to only 8% of other GBMs. because of the various different mutations. Now, the key thing here, and it all gets a bit technical, the key thing is that traditionally we've treated cancer by body part, liver cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, and even brain cancer. But actually, I think what we're realizing now is that we need to be looking at cancers at the genetic and molecular level, which means that we need to understand what are the mutations that are driving these cancers. And in the case of GBM, a very diverse cancer, there can be all sorts of different mutations. And there are treatments that are evolving, are being trialed and being trialed with increasing success. I mean, the outlook for breast cancer patients is much, much better than it was 20 years ago. Similarly for lung cancer patients. But GBM is one cancer that's got left behind. And
there's a reason for that, isn't there, Richard? Because there is a kind of reality about cancer treatments. There's a reality about priorities that are applied. There's a reality to a degree about cost. But the truth is with GBM, I don't know if you would agree with this sort of characterization, but because it's so difficult, because it's so deadly, and because, from a research perspective, the patients don't stay alive long enough for the sort of community, if you like, that might be able to make a difference around this cancer. They just don't prioritize it for that reason. It's too difficult for a whole bunch of different reasons to invest the time, to invest the money, to invest obviously the research, kind of resource into GBM. It's just it's the problem that's just a bit too difficult. And yet you might argue, and this was Jessica's argument, as you know, that that's the wrong way to look at it. The right way to look at it is to start with the most difficult. Because if you make progress on the most difficult, then surely you will inevitably have this kind of trickle down effect into other cancers. And if you can progress on GBM, you will inevitably progress faster on other cancers. Have I got that about right?
I think that's a very powerful argument, and it's one that was absolutely the heart of Jessica Morris's establishing of OBB. And she there's a slogan for OBB, which is moving glioblastoma from terminal to treatable through patient power. Going back to your question, I wish we'd done sequencing of the tumor earlier, because it was only after we did sequencing and then we explored options for treatment that we found some things that were over and above the treatment that was offered when Jaina was first diagnosed, the so-called gold standard, that did seem to offer some possibility of success. And indeed, one of the treatments that Jaina went through for a few months, her doctors seemed to think did probably give her several more months of a good quality of life. Of course, you read the trial results and you look and hope that some of the trial results are pointing in direction. Jaina, for more than a year, wore an electrical device on her head, which something called an Optune device, which used something called tumor treating fields. The idea being that these electrical waves would disrupt the tumor cell growth, and there are trial results that suggest that it does have some success. It does slow things down. Jaina tried that for a year, but we don't know whether it did slow things down or not. I hope it did, yes. Because it was a pretty awkward thing to have to shave your head every couple of days and put this sticky patches on your head and carry around a box that was sending out electrical signals.
It's important here to say, isn't it? I think that there are efforts being made. There is money actually being invested in something, but just not enough of it. And it's sort of disparate, isn't it? And then it comes back to that treasure hunt thing. You might find out about it, you might not. This is something perhaps we'll get onto in a second when we talk about the campaign that we're gonna run. But it's all a bit disparate. I remember with Deb, Phil, who was Deb's brilliant partner, who did such an amazing job for her, throughout her illness, and my older brother Paul. I remember the two of them somehow managed to kind of jigsaw some information together and discovered that there was a drug. I think it was called Vigancicloca or something similar. And I don't know if that was a drug that ever crossed your path. And they were really told, or in a corridor, really separately, that's the one you want. That will no cure, but that will definitely, give you the best shot at some more time. And I won't bore you with all the details, but suffice to say, through a sort of pincer movement, Phil and Paul managed to get some access to that drug because it wasn't readily available through the NHS. And it was just that kind of, it's like I was saying earlier, it's just that sort of unnecessary sort of treasure hunt element. Why can't that information be out there? And by the way, if the information is you're not going to get it through the NHS because it's too expensive, then just tell us. Just be super, super clear about what is available and what isn't available. This perhaps takes us on to the other bit of our campaign, Richard, and you've touched on it already, the genomic sequencing. But in essence, if you are diagnosed with a brain tumor in this country, you can ask for a piece of your tumor to be frozen, has to be frozen correctly, and a genomic sequencing process will be undertaken. You can actually ask for that now, can't you? That's a given.
I think we have to establish whether that's the case or not, because I'm not sure it is. Certainly, it was nothing. It was not something that was offered to Jaina, and we had to go about getting sequencing done by arranging it ourselves. And I'm a bit surprised that it was what are we 3 years ago. I'm a bit surprised that if it had been available then, we weren't told about it, and it was only this sort of chance conversation with a consultant who wasn't actually Jaina's consultant who said, "Oh, I think it could be useful if you went and got this sequenced." But that's what we've got to find out. We've got to find out, because it's quite clear that the treatments that are most likely to be successful are going to be ones that are guided by sequencing of the tumor to identify what it is that's driving a tumor, so that the appropriate targeted personalized treatment can be applied. Without that, you're just applying the traditional weapons of the oncologist, which is surgery, radiotherapy, chemotherapy. And the radiotherapy and the chemotherapy elements are like exploding a nuclear bomb, because they kill healthy cells as well as the cancerous cells.
Yes.
What the treatments that are developing now and are being used with some success in a number of different cancers are ones that will target the particular drivers of the mutations causing the cancer growth. So that, if you like, to use a war analogy, it's not a nuclear bomb. You're using a sniper to try and destroy the thing that's causing and driving your cancer growth. This country has some of the best and most advanced genomic sequencing facilities in the world, and it seems extraordinary that we're not rolling out the availability of that more widely than is currently the case.
Yes, I certainly think it's true to say that the two of us feel very strongly that it should be available
available, and there should be then sensible conversations that follow that analysis and say, well, these are the currently available options that give you a chance of something that's going to be beneficial.
Could we take the conversation back to Jaina, please, Richard? Just pick up after you described in some detail Jaina's bravery in the first operation. There was a second operation. There was that period of time where actually Jaina's symptoms were under control. That quality of life that you were talking about was there, but obviously things took a pretty dramatic turn for the worst, and as is the nature of GBM, quite a quick turn for the worst. Is that right?
Well, she had regular scans, as all GBM patients do, after the operation and the radiotherapy and chemotherapy, and they remained clear for a long time. And it was actually, I think, 15 months after the initial diagnosis that she went and had a scan which showed that there was a regrowth. And that, of course, that's devastating, because you think you feel you've held it at bay. We'd done all sorts of things. As I said, Jaina was wearing this electrical device, but she'd been skiing with it. She'd been climbing mountains with it on, and all the rest of it. That just after a mountain climbing brief holiday that she went to the hospital, and they said, no, I'm sorry, there's a regrowth. We were in the throes of COVID, and we got in touch with the hospital in Oxford that had done the first operation, and they agreed that she should have a second operation. But because of COVID, we were told there could be an up to a 6-week delay for Jaina to have the second operation. She was at that time already having some treatment in Germany, and we asked the German hospital, and they said, "Oh, we can operate next week." So she ended up having her second operation in southern Germany, in a hospital in a university town called Tübingen in Germany, and that was again very successful. The surgeon, who was a world-rated surgeon, said he got all the tumor out. And I have no doubt that, as far as he was concerned, he had. But the terrible thing about this disease is that it accelerates. And, she had that operation in September, and it was in November that the growth was back again. So it wasn't many months. We had 15 months of relatively carefree existence after the first operation, and only 3 months after the second.
How did you feel about the sort of level of support that you were getting, and the sort of options, if you like, that were open to you at that stage?
Well, this is by this stage, and this was in the autumn of 2020. So about a year into our researches, we knew a lot more about the disease by then, and we knew there was a debate about how recurrence should be treated. And the oncologist that Jaina was under at that time, we went to the oncologist and said, "Look, we know there are some different options here. Can we discuss it? In particular, there's a different drug that we think might be beneficial." But the oncologist said that, in their view, it was too dangerous. They wouldn't do it. They would simply go back onto the initial chemotherapy drug called temozolomide, which we know becomes less effective the more it's used.
Yes.
So at that point, we parted company with the oncologist that Jaina was under and moved to a different hospital. And she was having treatment through the German hospital and the hospital in London that we moved to, and she was able to get different drugs, a different approach to treatment, and then she was very, very sick by the end of that year. But a treatment that the German professor devised and discussed with us, she had through the early part of 2021, and actually that seemed to hold the tumor back. There was no growth for another 5 months. So having been accelerating horribly fast between the autumn of 2020 and sort of Christmas, the treatment she then went under, which was experimental, it was actually done under a German law called the individual healing attempt, in which a doctor can say, "Look, this is not a treatment that I would normally do, but I think in your case it might be beneficial, and I take full responsibility for it." And the doctor that she was under said, "Look, I've used this drug, this combination of drugs, with some success in the case of other tumors that show the similar signature to yours, have the same mutations driving it, but I've never used it in the case of someone with GBM." So possibly Jaina was the only patient in the world to have had that particular treatment for GBM, targeting a particular mutation she had.
How did you find that, doctor?
A long process, talking to people.
One of the problems with GBM is if you don't have that ability to either have the time, frankly, to be able to have that kind of purchase on how those kind of professions work, that you're very, very unlikely, aren't you, to uncover a way forward in the way that you did.
I think that's true. And I think one of the things that charities like our Brain Bank can do is to provide better information. There are charities that provide good information now, but really not in sufficient depth. I wish we had people who were cancer navigators, who were sufficiently expert to be able to help patients and their families through understanding what's going on at the cutting edge of oncology. What are the things? Where are the trials that might be relevant? What are the treatments that are being developed that might be appropriate in your particular case? And I don't think the health system as it currently stands offers that kind of navigation service. I think you get put into a system whereby there's a standard of care, there's a certain form of treatment, and unless you're lucky enough to find yourself with an oncologist or a surgeon who is deeply involved in research, you're unlikely to even have a discussion about potential options. And even if they are involved in research, it might be a trial that's seemingly inappropriate. I mean, Jaina was offered a trial really early on, and she turned it down because she was worried about the side effects. And it was only after we'd done the genomic sequencing of her tumor that we discovered that she didn't have any mutations that were relevant to that particular trial. So she would have gone on to a trial for which she was a singularly inappropriate patient.
Well, what you've just said is a great demonstration of the genomic side of the campaigning work that we're going to do, because that, there's an example of where we got terribly excited about the possibility of a trial. Jaina, it sounds like, had exactly the right sort of instinct about it. And you just would have gone down not just a blind alley, but it could actually have been detrimental. Richard, do you mind if we move forward a little? I know this is difficult and it's painful, but could you just? I think it's important that we kind of bring the story forward to I would say the sort of end of 2021, when things really began to deteriorate very badly for Jaina. Again, I'm going to ask the same question, really. I suppose the support, the kind of care that you had around Jaina at that point. The one thing, certainly from the experience that my family had, just outstanding levels of, once you get to that stage with a loved one, just outstanding levels of humanity and care and love. Really, your experience too?
Yes, very much so. I mean, things got difficult toward August, September of last year. Jaina had a fall. She was losing mobility, and she had a fall and hit her head, which caused a brain hemorrhage. And she went into hospital. And she was in hospital actually for 2 weeks, and that was the longest stay she had in hospital, because by this stage she couldn't get upstairs any longer, and we had to move a bed downstairs, and she needed a wheelchair and other things. The support that Jaina got, I mean, it made my life. Things had been getting difficult before, and helping Jaina move around, I actually damaged myself just helping support her, walking and things like that. And once we had the support from the carers on a daily basis, once we had the equipment that was able to provide the support she needed, that made things a lot better. But so she came home, and things were still pretty good. But then she had a spontaneous hemorrhage some weeks later, which took her back into hospital. And I was in the hospital with the kids with Jaina, and she had almost no response on what's called the Glasgow coma scale. And basically the doctor said she's dying. They didn't think she'd last many days, if possibly not many hours. And the kids and I talked to the end of life, the palliative care consultant, and said, look, we don't want her to die in hospital. Can we bring her home? And she said, yes, you can, but I'm not sure she'll survive the ambulance journey. We said, well, we do want to get her home. We don't want her to die in the hospital. And she was responding to us, but she wasn't responding to the doctors at all. And so we got her home and she was fine and she was in bed. And the palliative care nurses came in and said, well, she's in a very, very poor state. But within 2 or 3 days, Jaina was sitting up. And within 4 days, she was joining us for dinner at the dining room table. And the palliative care nurses said they'd never seen anyone recover from such a serious coma in the way that she did. So that was in, I guess that was September of last year. And we had some great weeks. After that, we got to the theatre, to museums, to concerts in Oxford, theatre in London. Jaina was a trustee of a theatre company. We got to one of their shows at the Young Vic Theatre in London, and Jaina was in a wheelchair, so she had to be in the front row. And one of the theatre staff came around and said, "This second half of the play. There's explosions and smoke, and it could get a little bit tricky." And Jaina said, "It'll be fine. It'll be fine." And she was there in the thick of it. Through that performance and really enjoyed it. So even though she was increasingly immobile and things were getting more and more difficult, and she enjoyed herself through the end of last year, through the autumn of last year, and she had a great Christmas. She said to us, she had all her family around and said she loved her Christmas, but it was on New Year's Eve that she fell into a coma again. And this time, unlike the previous occasion, she didn't come out. She was in a coma for 11 days. Her family were with her all the time, sitting around her bed. And my sisters, who's a professional musician, was playing the piano to her, and she was listening to the music she loved. But she was in a deep coma. And then on the 11th of January, she just quietly slipped away at 8 a.m. And her kids were with her, I was with her, her sisters were with her. And it was very, very peaceful, but very, very difficult for all of us.
Well, as you described, clearly it's the love and support of you and your 2 children that gave you that gave Jaina that extra time. Richard, when you think about her legacy, we talked about her professional legacy. Obviously, the most importantly for you, her legacy as your amazing wife and an amazing mother. But when you think about her legacy in the context of her illness, that is what drives you, isn't it? Really, for the OBB work that we've touched on in this conversation. It's important. It's important to you because it would have been important to
her. Yes, that's true, and not only am I interested in helping support OBB do a job that I think is really important for other glioblastoma patients, but also my son, he's just completing a business master's degree, and he's changed his attention from what his original plans for starting up a business. He's now wanting to start up a business that can help with getting genomic sequencing for a larger number of patients, and he's already having some really interesting conversations with the medical world and the pharmaceutical world about how that might be achieved. And I'm fingers crossed. He's got the energy and enthusiasm and the real determination to pull that off and make a difference. And our daughter, she's also equally focused on this and is going to be helping OBB as well. So yeah, I mean, the experience that we went through as a family, I think has been very, very significant. I think it's changed us all, and it's led us to see that there are some things that are, there's a lot right with the way in which we access healthcare in this country, but also there's a lot wrong. And I think the thing is that we want to move to a world in which the patient feels more empowered, and the patient's loved ones, family feel more empowered, and they feel they have a better understanding. They're not just caught up in a helter-skelter. not caught up in something over which they have no control and no say. And it's really important that if we can improve the understanding of treatments and options, that I think that's an important part of feeling you're doing the best you possibly can.
Richard, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your story and Jaina's story. We both, I know, think that this is an incredibly important topic that frankly hasn't yet had enough discussion around it. There are, we should both say, some amazing people out there doing some amazing work in and around GBM, including some other charities that are really working incredibly hard. Tessa Giles charity is an example, just doing fantastic work. But I'm certainly looking forward to working with you more on this, Richard. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you and to talk to you today as well, and to be able to talk about Jaina in the way that we have. Before we finish, though, I'm going to ask you for 3 crisis cures, if that's okay. These are 3 things that you lean on. Can't be another person is the only rule. So what comes to mind for you?
Oh dear. Can't be another person. Can it be persons plural? Because I lean on my kids. I mean, with crises we do discuss them in the family.
Alex and Skoma, yes.
Yeah, that's very important. Well, I think actually research. I think that's really, really important. Understanding the situation you're in to the best of your ability, understanding what options there are, understanding where you might go. I always feel more empowered if I have a better understanding of a situation rather than relying on gut feeling. Or
fantastic. Do you know, we're almost at our 50th podcast. No one has ever had knowledge as a crisis cure.
Probably a bit obvious, but the right kind of music will do it for me. And yeah. And that probably for me is a Mozart's Requiem or a Beethoven string quartet.
Wonderful.
That's just my kind of music.
You also mentioned Harvest Moon earlier. I know that's a song that you played at the memorial service as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it was the song that got her through that first 9-hour operation when she was there awake whilst the surgeon was digging into her head. So it can't be bad.
Goodness me. Okay, and your third cure, please.
Oh, I thought that was the persons plural was allowed, but
I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, that's fine.
No, bit of hiking in the mountains would be my third cure.
Very good. Richard, thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. And look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks. It was good to talk to you. And we do have a big job to do.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please do give us a rating and a review. It really helps. And if you hit subscribe, wherever you download your podcast from, you'll find loads more useful crisis conversations. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Our handle is @CrisisWhatCrisisPodcast. Thanks again for listening.